and I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, Jennifer Rubin. Ms. Rubin writes reported opinion for The Washington Post. She covers politics and policy, foreign and domestic, and provides insight into the conservative movement, the Republican and Democratic parties, and threats to Western democracies. Ms. Rubin, who's also an MSNBC contributor, came to the Post after 3 years with Commentary magazine. Prior to her career in journalism, she practiced labor law for 2 decades, an experience that informs and enriches her work. She's a mother of 2 sons and lives in Northern Virginia. Welcome, Jennifer, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. I want to thank the ADL for putting together what's really been an extraordinary program already. It is also a pleasure to follow Mayor Garcetti. I was an Angelino for on and off for about 3 or 4 decades. And prior to this call, I got to thinking, in the weeks leading up to my wedding in 1992, my then fiance and I observed the Rodney King riots and the destruction, the anger, the sense of helplessness that so many people in Los Angeles felt. And now, 28 years later, still happily married, thank God, how much has changed? How much have we progressed? How much have we learned? And sadly, little. And I think that is the great challenge of our lives. When I was preparing for this, I thought to myself, gosh, if this had been a year ago, I would have spoken about the rise in anti-Semitic incidents or the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. If it was just a few months ago, I would have spoken about the COVID-19 virus and the spurring of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that we've now seen circulate in connection with this terrible virus. But of course, in a flash, everything has changed. And why in a flash? It's because the power of the visual image, the power of seeing for our own eyes. Our African American brothers and sisters rightly ask, what took you so long? Haven't you been listening? Haven't you been seeing? There's a long list of names. And the answer is that seeing is believing for many Americans. Many Americans have felt it impossible to imagine the type of systemic, widespread racism that African Americans experience on a daily basis. But in those 9 minutes of videotape, they could see the lack of humanity, the lack of empathy, the helplessness of someone who was not resisting the police, was not becoming violent, but was a victim of violence. And so I think as many Americans come to terms with this, we're right to be impatient, but I think the power of the image continues to be something very much in our favor. And I think the telephone, which is now the camera for hundreds of millions of Americans, becomes truly our aid in opening the eyes of the American people. I look back today on the March on Washington. We're going to have a recap of that 52 years later this August. But I look back to the March on Washington, and somewhere in my memory, I recalled, and it turned out to be accurate, that the person who spoke just before Martin Luther King was a rabbi. Was Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who had been a rabbi in Germany in the war years. And first of all, it struck me as extraordinary that that really prominent position had been given to someone who was not African American and someone who was Jewish. I went back to look at what he said, and I think his words were as prophetic and as important then as they are now. And he said, as a Jewish American, he felt a particular responsibility and a particular connection with the African American community. Why? Because our faith teaches us that from the time of Abraham, God created neighbors. And that is not geographic neighbors, but neighbors who are committed to one another, who are linked from a common destiny, and who have a responsibility to care for one another. We're also linked, of course, in a history of persecution, a history of slavery. And although the experiences of African Americans and Jewish Americans is quite different, the passage of persecution and slavery to freedom is a common journey that in our bones we can feel. When we feel that not only here in America, but across the world, democracies are under assault by illiberal regimes that call the press the enemy of the people, that destroy the very notion of truth so they can perpetrate the big lie, that erode norms of democracy and the rule of law. We know what that experience is and are especially attuned to it and should be attuned to it. The rabbi at the March in Washington said something that was interesting towards the end of his remarks, and that was he felt, even having been a rabbi in Berlin, that the greatest threat was not hate and was not bigotry, but was silence. And that this regime, this people that had reached great heights of sophistication and intellectual exercise had become passive onlookers in mass murder. And then in 1963, the rabbi pled with the people who are listening, do not become a nation of onlookers. Do not become passive in the face of what you see. And that could not be more true today. And I think what gives me hope, probably more so than at any time in my life, more hope than I had in 1992, some 28 years ago, is that when we see the crowds, these massive demonstrations, it is not simply African Americans. It is not simply the young. It is old and young, white and black, that there has been a coming together of America around what should be the promise of America. We are a creedal country. We believe not in blood and soil as our identification, not in religion, but in the creed that all men are created equal. That is such an abstract concept that it is hard sometimes to construct a peoplehood around it. But now we have a very vivid image of what that really means and what the American promise can be and should be. And I think in the experience that we have collectively gone through, we should remember, as the mayor so eloquently put it, that we all have a role to play. None of us can be onlookers. Those of us in the press have to fearlessly explain what has happened. Our reporters out in the street facing violence themselves have to fearlessly explain and show what is happening. Those of us who write in the opinion area have to help the population make sense of this, to try to draw some lessons, to try to highlight certain universal themes. Government has a role to play. Faith leaders have a role to play. Magnificent organizations like the ADL have a role to play. Schools have a role to play. Business has a role to play. There is no one, no institution, no aspect, no corner of America that can be absent from this experience. This is our collective responsibility. And it's an interesting phenomenon in politics, which I write a great deal about, and that is that politicians, even the best of them, rarely lead, but they can follow quickly. And what we've seen is this has been a people's expression. This has been ordinary Americans who have amassed in the street. The best of the politicians will seize the moment for systemic change, for reform, not only in police and criminal justice, but beyond that. And the rush to catch up, some will be faster than others. Some will still object and put their foot down. We saw the unbelievably despicable scene this week of a Republican senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, objecting to unanimous consent for an anti-lynching bill. My heart broke, and I realized that not everyone in power hardly will undertake this trek, this journey willingly. but as a united people, both inside and outside government, we can do this. And I come back to those very institutions which I feared almost 4 years ago would be under siege, which are now the cornerstone of our democracy and which will show us the way forward. A free and independent press, independent courts that can assess liability and can assess accountability, a government that ideally is not simply led by the executive branch, but has an equally vital, important legislative branch, the rule of law. These are the things that we come back to, not only as Jews and American, but as Americans. And that when we are stressed, when we look for a way forward, that we have to reinforce and return to so that we can once more address what has been the original sin of America, and that is race. So despite my anguish, as many of you have felt over the last few weeks, I am, for the first time in perhaps 4 years, filled with hope that there is a widespread recognition that there is an outpouring of decency, that there is the desire to improve America. And that, I hope, will sustain us and carry us from the streets into the legislatures, into the city councils, into the halls of police reform, into the halls of Congress, and to the White House as well. So again, my great thanks to the ADL. It's a privilege to be here. And my absolute thanks and appreciation for the work that the ADL does. It is not infrequently that I rely on them as a journalist, and they have always been prompt and eloquent in their contributions. So thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much for those terrific remarks. And I must say, very hopeful. I'm really encouraged, to hear you and be in dialogue with you, because your columns are always so sharp and insightful. And today I think you've really, give us a bit more insight into how you think. So I do want to ask you, as someone who's been involved in the conservative movement for years, who is a very reliable voice in journals like Commentary and in the Post and on cable news, help us make sense at this moment and where the conservative movement is, if you will, because I find it a bit confusing and would love whatever insight you can share.
Absolutely. It is a confusing moment. And the use of names and the claim to names and titles and labels has become such that it is very confusing for the average person to figure out. I look at it this way, that currently there is not a conservative movement. There is an authoritarian movement. There is a party that has been really subsumed to illiberal nationalism, to a racial and xenophobic agenda that in no way resembles what we think of as traditional Republican or conservative views, which are actually small L liberal views, the rule of law, limited government, and in the case of the more modern Republican Party, leadership in the world, support for democratic regimes, denunciation of repression and of persecution of minorities. None of that is, I think, the ideological framework now that the Republican Party operates through. And when people say, "Are you a Republican?" I say no. When they say, "Are you a conservative?" I say, it depends upon what you mean. And I think some of these labels have to be really thrown away and we have to begin anew. And my own personal experience over the last few years has been incredibly informative and dramatic and moving, in which I think many of us, and there's a whole little band of us, sometimes referred to as never Trumpers, have really put aside partisanship. We've put aside the specifics, the nitty gritty of some policy issues, and have really reached out to our brothers and sisters in the center, in the left, wherever we will find them, in defense of those democratic institutions, that this has been an all hands on deck moment, that people who may disagree on the top marginal tax rate or on the appropriate level of defense spending, we now have much greater concerns: the preservation of our democracy, equal justice under the law. And I think in reaching out and finding these common voices, it has been, first of all, a revolution and a revelation for me that we have so much more in common than some of these partisan fights that some of these really petty, minimalistic issues might suggest. That if you cannot lift your eyes at this moment and make common cause with ideologically diverse people on issues like racism, on issues like the freedom of the press, you are truly lost. And I think that reevaluation of priorities, the sense that we have a all hands on deck moment that requires systemic change, that requires that people of goodwill step forward, whatever have been their past ideological differences, can be transforming for the country and can be transforming for our republic. I want to stress the ADL is a nonpartisan organization, and the following personal, non-affiliated comments, and that is, it is vital for those of us who have seen the threat of Donald Trump, who saw at the beginning all of those signs of anti-democratic, small d, democratic belief and sentiment. It is incumbent upon all of us to work to remove not just Trump, but Trumpism. It's only when a party is completely leveled, it is only when losses are so complete from the presidency down to the smallest town city council that we have a hope of recreating an effective two-party system. People often ask me, well, what do you hope about the Republican Party? What do you, are they rescuable? What do you think about them? And the answer is, I'll let you know. First, they have to be leveled. They have to be leveled to the ground. That a noxious philosophy has overtaken one of the great political parties, the party of Lincoln, the party of Teddy Roosevelt, the party that was associated with a great many reforms in America. And that has to be eliminated. This is not a matter of partisanship. This is a matter of identification of an alien view, an un-American view, an anti-democratic view that really we have to remove from our society. And we can then, there'll be plenty of time down the road to collect ourselves, to figure out how much government is too much government, to figure out exactly how America should express our support and our differences with the state of Israel, to make arguments about immigration one way or the other. But it's not until we have a fundamental reaffirmation of what it means to be an American, of these fundamental values of equality before the law, of racial justice, of a free press, of the right of free assembly. My gosh, I never in my lifetime thought that that would become a controversial issue. Unless we get those things right, forget about the two-party system. There's no system. There's no democratic system. And that's why I think the outpouring in the street is, for me personally, somewhat of a confirmation that we can put smaller issues aside, that we can find common themes, common aspirations, and that we are not so divided as a country. We're not hopelessly divided. We have to be unified in the right things and put the right priorities at the top of our lists. And that these things that are so much greater than one generation of Americans, so much greater than a political party, can and should take the fore.
Here, here. I mean, I think, it's funny when you lay it out like that, it's very difficult to argue. And I've talked the same. I mean, I think authoritarianism, militarism, these are the enemies, not just of the Jewish people, but of all people, certainly all people who want to be in a democratic system. But I have a second question for you. It feels almost minor relative to what you've just laid out, but I still want to ask it because it comes up through the chat. So, there's been a bit of a sideshow controversy over the past week with the New York Times and the publication of the Tom Cotton op-ed. And then there was, I think, our mutual friend Barry Weiss's piece on Twitter about sort of safetyism, if you will. Again, as someone who is clearly not bound to any party and sees things with a kind of ideological sort of clarity, or non-ideological, I'm sorry, sense kind of clarity. What do you make of the state of the newsroom today? How should we think about this?
Well, in terms of the specific issue of the Tom Cotton piece, I have great respect for Barry Weiss, and we agree on many issues. On this, I strongly part company with her. There is a special obligation of the media at this time. It is not a job of government to censor. It is not the job of government to decide newsroom judgment. But at a time like this, it is incumbent upon those of us in the newsrooms, in the opinion sections, whether editorial, management, lowly writers like myself, to think before we write, to understand that what I may think is an academic discussion has especially real consequences right now that affect some of our brothers and sisters in physical life or death situations. And that not every thought that pops into the head of a US senator is deserving of elevation. That views can certainly be confronted. Views can be explained without giving a forum for all views at this very time. And I think, how would we as Jews feel if the New York Times gave a platform for the BDS movement on Holocaust Remembrance Day? It's a point of view, but not all points of view at all times are deserving of a space on one of the top newspapers in America. I look upon the obligation of the press during this time in two ways. One is with unfailing courage and clarity to show America what is going on. I think even those of us who had our eyes opened from the original incident have still been horrified by the repeated acts of excessive policing that we have seen play out. That there is no need for peaceful protesters to be gassed, to be shot at with rubber bullets. And that we saw the proof was in the pudding, that when the police drew back over the last couple of days, when the National Guard receded in Washington, the demonstrations were overwhelmingly peaceful. And it's that story of conflict and engagement that we as news people have to not only show so people can evaluate, but also put in context and describe in ways that the average person can and should hear. And I think the other obligation of the press, perhaps more so on the opinion side than on the news side, is quite simply to give some hope, to give a constructive path forward. It is very easy to fall into cynicism bordering on nihilism. They're all awful. Everyone is to blame. Everyone is a racist. Everything is rotten to the core. And unfortunately, what that does is it paralyzes us. It stops us from making intelligent choices, whether at the ballot box or elsewhere. And we can't do that. Politics is choosing. Life is choosing. And it's incumbent, I think, of those of us who try to inform and shape opinion to not only criticize, not only to denounce, but also to elevate, to explain, to suggest, to cajole, to encourage those voices that are so positive. And I'm so glad that Mayor Garcetti was here today. I forget whether it was this week or last, as you know, Jonathan, the weeks were, mushed together. But he joined two other magnificent mayors. The mayor of Atlanta, actually there were three mayors, the mayor of St. Paul, and it was the mayor of, I can't remember, those Washington, D.C., Chicago, Lori Lightfoot. And the level of leadership, the level of thoughtfulness there, we talk about a dearth of leadership. We have to find where the leaders are. They are there. They may not be in Congress. They may not be in the White House. But there are magnificent leaders who I think have stepped out of their role as simply the executives of a level of government to be empathetic leaders, to literally and figuratively join people in the streets. And it is so vital for them to do it. And it's incumbent upon us who write, who explain, who point, who shed a light, to elevate those voices, because that's the way forward. It's the Lori Lightfoots, it's the Eric Garcettis, it's the Muriel Bowsers who are going to lead us to a better place. And I think in spite of all of the horrible events, and one comes after the next this year. I am old enough to remember, as they say, when impeachment was the biggest issue of the year, which seems like a lifetime ago. I am absolutely filled with hope, and for the first time in a long time, filled with pride for Americans, for coming together, for peaceful demonstration, for a moment of unity. And I truly pray, I didn't use that euphemistically, but I pray that this moment continues and that we simply don't relegate this to another name on a long list of horrific incidents involving the police, and that, like Selma, help push the Voting Rights Act over the edge, that this is the inspiration for some real systemic change in America.
Well, look, I'll just say, Jennifer, I really appreciated your most recent column on collective action and how you talk, even here this afternoon, about the fact that we need leaders, not just in an elected office, at the community level, from business, and you've just cited a number of different amazing, I think, bold mayors. But I think we need leaders in all quarters, and I will suggest that we need leaders on our opinion pages as well. And again, your willingness to call it like it is, to call balls and strikes, regardless of the consequences, I think is really a representation of what media can and should do. And I think all of us here at ADL, and I think in the Jewish community in the country, are grateful for the leadership you've shown. So thank you for that, Jennifer.
Thank you for those very kind words, Jonathan. It means the world to me. Thank you.
Thank you.